Story 1. The Room of Silence. In an old building in the heart of the city, there was a floor that remained eternally deserted. Few remembered its existence, and those who did avoided mentioning it. It was the top floor of an office building, and ever since something inexplicable happened there, no one dared to go up to it. The silence on that floor was different. It wasn't the usual quiet of an empty place, but a deep silence, as if time itself had stopped there. Lucas, a young writer seeking inspiration for his new book, was intrigued by the stories he heard about the place. He lived in one of the building's apartments, and despite the janitor's warnings, his curiosity drove him to investigate. Tired of nights without inspiration, he decided the mystery of that floor might be exactly what he needed to awaken his creativity. That night, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow, dusty stairs leading to the top floor. The silence was absolute. The hallway lights were off, and only the faint glow of Lucas' flashlight illuminated his path. When he finally reached the forbidden floor, a strange feeling of emptiness washed over him. The air felt heavier, dense, as if something invisible was hovering over him. The office doors were locked, and the place smelled of mold and abandonment. Lucas passed by several doors until he reached the end of the hallway, where a large room had its door slightly ajar. It was as if the place had been waiting for him. Upon entering the room, Lucas sensed something was wrong. The air was colder there, and the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally, distorted, as if the space itself was absorbing the sound. He turned on his flashlight, and the light revealed a nearly empty room, except for an old wooden desk in the center and a chair covered by a white sheet. The walls were covered in stained and cracked mirrors, reflecting his image in strange, distorted ways. The moment he approached the desk, the environment grew even quieter. Lucas felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He ran his hand over the dusty surface of the desk and saw finger marks, as if someone had recently been there, handling something. Papers were scattered on the desk, manuscripts with blurred words, but before he could read them, a low, muffled sound broke the silence. It wasn't a natural sound. It came from the walls, a faint noise as if something was trying to escape from inside them. He froze. The sound stopped for a moment, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. His flashlight flickered, and Lucas saw, in the reflection of one of the cracked mirrors, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. His heart raced. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for him, but the shadow was there, in the mirrors, watching him from different angles. Suddenly, all the lights on the floor flickered on at once, blinking erratically as if there was an electrical failure. Lucas backed away, breathing heavily. He tried to leave the room, but the door that had been slightly open was now closed, locked from the inside as if some invisible force had shut it. The mirrors began to vibrate slightly, and he saw something that took his breath away. The shadows in the mirrors were multiplying, their human forms twisting and stretching. Then the voices began, soft at first but soon growing into a relentless whisper. They weren't words he could understand, but every whisper seemed like a command, a direct order for him not to leave. Terrified, Lucas threw himself against the door, pounding hard, desperately trying to open it. The voices grew louder with every knock, now seeming to merge with the sound of the mirrors cracking, as if the figures in the reflections were trying to escape. Finally, with one last push, the door opened and Lucas stumbled out into the hallway. The silence on the floor returned instantly, but he didn't dare look back. He ran down the stairs, the echoes of his footsteps seeming to follow him until he reached his apartment, chest heaving and heart racing. For days, Lucas tried to make sense of what had happened in that room. His nights were filled with nightmares, and the feeling of being watched never completely went away. He avoided going up to the top floor, but he always felt that something kept calling him, whispering his name in a way that only he could hear. A few days later, the building's janitor was found unconscious in the hallway on the top floor. He had gone to check what was happening with the electricity, which strangely flickered at the same time every night. When he awoke, the man only muttered one phrase repeatedly: "The room is never empty. They're always there, waiting." Since then, the top floor of the building has been completely sealed off. But for Lucas, the sound of that room's silence continued to echo in his mind, and the broken mirrors reflected much more than he could ever understand. Story 2, The Midnight Song. In an isolated village nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, there was a legend that had frightened the villagers for generations. At midnight, a mysterious song could be heard echoing through the hills, a haunting and melancholic melody played on an instrument no one could identify. Those who dared to follow the sound were never seen again. The villagers believed the song was a call from something ancient, something that dwelled in the shadows of the mountains, and once heard, it could not be ignored. Mariana, a young musician searching for inspiration for her compositions, arrived at the village unaware of the legend. She was looking for a quiet place to write her music and had heard about the valley's beauty. Fascinated by the surrounding nature, Mariana decided to stay at the small local inn, enjoying the isolation to focus on her work. On the first night, while walking near the hills, she heard the melody for the first time. It was soft, almost ethereal, but deeply sad. The melody seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried by the wind blowing through the mountains. Instead of fear, Mariana felt intrigued. As a musician, the song touched something deep inside her. She wanted to know where it came from, who was playing it. When she asked the villagers about the song, she was met with fearful looks and stern warnings not to follow the sound. The midnight song is not meant to be heard by human ears, they said. It's a call we cannot answer. But Mariana wasn't swayed by the warnings. To her, the melody was exactly what she needed, a unique inspiration that would help her create something new and exciting. On the second night, when the melody returned, she decided to follow it. Taking her flashlight and a small recorder, Mariana left the inn and began walking toward the sound. The wind carried the song through the darkness, and the road ahead was winding and shrouded in deep shadows. The full moon illuminated the hills, but still, something felt unsettling. The silence around her was interrupted only by the song, which grew stronger with every step she took. As she climbed the hills, the melody became clearer, sharper. The sound of the instrument was unlike anything Mariana had ever heard. It wasn't a violin nor a piano, but something that seemed to mix elements of both, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. After a long walk, Mariana reached a clearing at the top of the hill. The wind was colder there, and the sound of the melody seemed to come from the center of the clearing, where a small lake mirrored the moon's glow. Mariana paused for a moment, marveling at the beauty of the place. But then something caught her attention. In the center of the lake, floating in the water like a pale shadow, there was a human figure. The song stopped abruptly, and the oppressive silence that followed made Mariana's heart race. The figure in the water seemed motionless, its long dark hair floating around it, and a sense of unease washed over Mariana. Suddenly, the figure began to move slowly toward the shore, and the song resumed, but this time softer, almost like a whisper. Mariana backed away, her body frozen with fear. She tried to turn back, but her feet seemed stuck to the ground as if something invisible was holding her in place. The figure emerged from the water, its eyes completely black and lifeless. The melody continued, but now it seemed distorted, as if coming from somewhere far away. Mariana tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The creature approached, its feet not touching the ground, and every movement seemed out of sync, as if it were trapped between this world and another. With one final effort, Mariana managed to free herself and ran down the hill, the sound of the melody still echoing in her ears. When she reached the village, she was pale and gasping for breath. She tried to tell the villagers what she had seen, but no one was surprised. They simply shook their heads sadly. "Those who hear the midnight song are never the same again," they said. "It has chosen you now." In the days that followed, Mariana tried to continue her life as usual, but something had changed. The melody never left her mind. She heard it even when it wasn't playing, a constant echo in her head. At night, she dreamed of the figure in the lake, its empty, expressionless face watching her. The more she tried to compose new music, the more her mind was consumed by the haunting melody. On the last night of her stay in the village, Mariana decided to return to the hill. She couldn't bear to live with the sound in her head anymore. She climbed the hill in silence, without her recorder, without her flashlight. When she reached the clearing, the melody was already playing, soft and welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her. Mariana approached the lake, where the water was calm and reflected the full moon. The figure was no longer there, but the song continued. With a resigned sigh, Mariana stepped into the lake, her clothes heavy as they were pulled by the water. The melody grew louder now, like a dark embrace, and when the water covered her body, she finally felt the silence. The next morning, Mariana's recorder was found by the edge of the lake. The melody could still be heard, but no one dared approach. They say that on nights of the full moon, the midnight song still plays through the hills, and if you listen closely, you can hear a new voice accompanying the melody, forever lost in the darkness. Story 3. The Lighthouse Without Light. In a small coastal village surrounded by treacherous cliffs and turbulent seas, there was a lighthouse that had long since stopped working. It stood tall but desolate at the edge of a steep cliff, its windows broken, and its structure corroded by the sea salt. Though its light had been extinguished for decades, the fishermen of the village told stories about how, on certain nights, a faint light could be seen flickering from the top of the tower. The light, they said, came from something that wasn't human. Mateus, a photographer of abandoned places, arrived in the village after hearing these stories. Fascinated by desolate places and ghostly tales, he decided the lighthouse would be the perfect setting for his next series of photographs. The villagers warned him to stay away from the lighthouse, especially at night. It's a cursed place, they said. Those who see the light never return. But Mateus didn't believe in superstitions. The idea of capturing a photo of the abandoned lighthouse with the mysterious light excited him. He decided to climb to the lighthouse that very night when the tide was low and the sky was dark. After preparing his equipment, he set out for the cliff, his camera slung over his shoulder, flashlight in hand, and courage soon to be tested. The wind blew fiercely that night, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. Mateus followed the narrow path to the top of the cliff, where the lighthouse awaited him, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The structure was even more decayed than he had imagined. Broken windows, rust eating away at the metal that once guided many sailors away from danger. Yet, something in the air felt wrong, a sense of oppression, as if the very sea was holding its breath, watching Mateus every step. As he approached the base of the lighthouse, he noticed a strange fog forming around the tower. The mist seemed to rise from the ground, dense and heavy, swallowing the surrounding rocks. Mateus felt a chill run down his spine, but he ignored the discomfort and continued climbing the spiral staircase that led to the top. With each step, the wind howled louder as if trying to push him away. The stone walls of the lighthouse were cold to the touch, and the sound of his footsteps echoed eerily through the tower, creating a disconcerting cacophony. When he finally reached the top, he found a weathered wooden door. It creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the room where the lighthouse's light used to shine. The circular room was empty, except for the rusted structure that once housed the powerful lamp. Mateus took a step forward, pulling out his camera to capture the view from the top of the lighthouse. However, the moment he pointed the lens at the window, something peculiar happened. A faint light flickered on the horizon, like a distant lighthouse. He was intrigued, but what happened next made him freeze in place. The light flickered again, this time much closer, as if it were rapidly approaching the shore. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was just below, hovering over the violent waves. The light was intense, but something about it felt wrong. It was cold, bluish, almost spectral, and it moved erratically. Heart pounding, Mateus snapped a few photos, trying to capture the phenomenon. But when he looked at the camera, the light didn't appear in the images. His flashlight began to flicker, and the lighthouse, which had been long extinguished, emitted a faint glow for a brief second. Mateus looked at the lens where the lamp once stood, but there was nothing that could generate light. Still, the glow persisted, as if the lighthouse itself was trying to reignite. Suddenly he heard a sound. It was a low murmur, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the lighthouse. At first, he thought the wind was causing the noise, but soon realized it was words, whispered in a language he didn't recognize. The sound seemed to grow, surrounding him from all sides. When he looked back out the window, he saw the light was now directly below the lighthouse, floating over the sea like a ghostly lantern. Then the light began to rise. With horror, Mateus watched as the light slowly ascended the cliff toward him as if it were alive, searching for him. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, and the whispers turned into muffled screams, voices that seemed to come from all directions. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground as if the lighthouse itself was preventing his escape. The light passed through the broken window and materialized inside the room. Now it had a form, a human-like figure made of cold, distorted light, with empty eyes staring at him. The figure's face was indistinct, as if it were being distorted by the very energy it emitted. Mateus tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. The figure reached out toward him, and the moment it touched him, Mateus felt a cold so deep he thought his heart would stop. His bones ached, and his vision began to darken. The lighthouse emitted one final flicker of light, and then everything went silent. The figure disappeared, and the room returned to total darkness. The next day, fishermen found Mateus' camera near the base of the lighthouse. There was no sign of him, only footprints leading to the edge of the cliff and vanishing. When they looked at the photos, the last image showed the view of the sea, but a strange bluish light floated on the horizon. In the corner of the photo, an indistinct figure could be seen, watching the sea as if waiting for something. Since then, the villagers have avoided the lighthouse, especially at night. The mysterious light continues to appear over the sea, always before a storm, and they say that if you stay silent long enough, you can hear Mateus' whispers, forever trapped in the lighthouse, waiting for the light to return. Story 4, The Room of Lost Dreams. In a forgotten town, where the streets were narrow and the old houses seemed to crumble under the weight of time, there was an inn that no one dared to frequent. The Aurora Inn, an imposing building with tall windows and dusty curtains, was known to hold a dark secret. It was said that once you stayed there, you would begin to have dreams that weren't your own, dreams that would pull you into places you should never visit. And the scariest part was that, on some mornings, those who slept in its rooms never woke up. Renata, an investigative journalist, was sent to the town to investigate the stories about the inn. Skeptical of legends and superstitions, she believed that all these stories were just inventions to attract tourists. Determined to debunk the mystery, she booked a room at the inn despite the warnings of the locals. Upon arrival, Renata was greeted by an elderly woman, the innkeeper, who guided her to her room on the second floor. The hallway was long and dimly lit, with the wooden floor creaking under her feet. The walls were covered in worn wallpaper, and the air felt heavy as if time itself had stopped. The old woman handed her the room key, but before leaving she whispered, "Don't try to understand the dreams, girl. Some are meant to be forgotten." Renata ignored the warning and entered the room. It was small and simple, with an old wooden bed, a chair, and a dusty mirror. She closed the curtains and lay down, ready to rest after the long journey. That night, Renata began to dream. At first, the dream seemed harmless. She was walking through an unfamiliar forest, moving between tall trees enveloped in mist. The sound of leaves crunching under her feet guided her along a path that seemed endless. However, she soon realized something was wrong. There were other figures in the forest, shadows moving between the trees, but always out of sight. And there were whispers, faint voices that made no sense, blending with the sound of the wind. Suddenly, the path ahead opened into a clearing where an old, moss-covered cabin stood. The door of the cabin was ajar, and a dim light shone from within. Renata felt an inexplicable urge to enter, as if something inside her was pulling her toward the cabin. When she crossed the threshold, the air grew cold and thick, and the whispers intensified. Inside the cabin, there was a rocking chair, and sitting on it was a shadowy figure, mumbling incessantly. Renata tried to approach, but before she could see the figure's face, she woke with a start. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment she felt disoriented. The dream had been so vivid that the sound of the whispers still seemed to echo in her ears. In the days that followed, Renata continued to have more dreams, each stranger than the last. In one, she found herself in an abandoned house, with doors that led to impossible places, a desert with no end, a raging sea, a ghostly city. In another, she was on an empty street where every house had windows but no one ever looked out. The dreams felt real, and each time she woke, she felt more exhausted, as if she hadn't really rested. But it was on the fourth day that things took a truly frightening turn. Renata dreamed she was back at the inn in the same room where she was sleeping, but something was different. The room seemed larger, the walls darker, and there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. In the mirror, the reflection didn't show her face, but that of someone she had never seen before. a woman with a sorrowful expression and hollow, sunken eyes. The reflection of the woman began to move on its own, and Renata realized the figure in the mirror was smiling, a cold, lifeless smile. Terrified, Renata tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't open. The reflection now seemed alive, moving with an unnatural ease. When she looked at the mirror again, the woman was gone, replaced by a void, a darkness so dense it seemed to suck in the light around it. She woke up panting, but the relief was brief. The air in the room was freezing, and something felt different. When she looked at the mirror, she was horrified to see that the woman's reflection was still there, watching her from inside the glass. But this time it wasn't a dream. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The figure approached the glass, her eyes fixed on Renata, as a macabre smile spread across her face. Renata backed away, but something was keeping her from leaving the room. The reflection began to bang on the glass as if trying to escape, and Renata realized the sound was growing louder, echoing throughout the empty room. The next morning, the innkeeper found the room empty. Renata had disappeared, and the only thing left behind was the mirror, now without any reflection. They say that if you look closely into the mirror at Aurora Inn, you can see Renata's reflection, forever trapped in her dreams, waiting for someone to set her free. And since then, those who stay at the Aurora Inn never sleep without the feeling that something is watching them, something trying to invade their dreams. Story 5. The Photograph of Despair. At the end of a deserted road, surrounded by tall, ancient trees, stood a small country house that no one ever visited. For decades, the house had remained abandoned, but inside it, one object drew the attention of many curious onlookers: an old camera, forgotten on a dust-covered table. People said the camera had the power to capture not just the image but the very soul of anyone who dared be photographed by it. Ricardo, an amateur photographer fascinated by vintage cameras, heard the story of the camera and decided he had to see it with his own eyes. He always thought legends like this were just tales meant to scare people, and the idea of finding a forgotten vintage camera thrilled him. Fearless, he set out for the abandoned house on a cloudy morning, bringing along his equipment and adventurous spirit. Upon arriving, Ricardo encountered a decrepit sight. The wooden walls were rotting, the windows shattered, and the door groaned heavily when he pushed it open. The smell of mold and dust was thick in the air, and the silence inside the house was almost deafening. There was nothing but debris and cobwebs except for the camera. It sat exactly where the story said it would, on a table in the corner of the main room. Despite being old, the camera seemed intact, almost as if time had stopped around it. Ricardo picked it up carefully, admiring the weight and the detailed lens and metal body. He decided he would test the camera then and there. After all, what harm could come from taking just one picture? Ricardo set up the camera on a tripod and prepared to take a self-portrait. He adjusted the frame, checked the lighting, and finally pressed the shutter. The flash went off, and for a second, the room was bathed in bright light. When the light faded, the silence returned, but Ricardo felt something strange. It was as if the air around him had grown denser, heavier, and the house seemed somehow darker than before. He removed the film from the camera and stored it to develop later, determined to see if the equipment still worked. However, as the day wore on and Ricardo continued to explore the house, something began to disturb him. Every time he glanced at the camera, he had the eerie feeling it was watching him back, as if it wasn't just an inanimate object. The discomfort grew by the minute, until he decided he had seen enough. Back at his studio, Ricardo developed the photos. The first one, taken with his own camera, came out perfectly as expected. But the second photo, the one he took with the old camera, stopped him in his tracks. In the image, he was standing in the center of the room as planned, but something was very wrong. Behind him, in the shadows, an indistinct figure was forming, a faceless human shadow merely watching. Startled, Ricardo looked around the studio, but he was alone. He tried to explain the image away as a film error or a trick of the light, but the unease lingered. In the following days, the situation worsened. Every time he looked at the photograph, the figure seemed to be closer, as if it were moving toward him. And the worst part, he started hearing whispers. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They started faintly in the silence of the night, and grew louder with each passing evening. Ricardo tried to ignore them, telling himself it was just his imagination, but he could no longer sleep. The eyes of the faceless figure in the photo, though invisible, seemed to follow him wherever he went. One night, desperate and exhausted, he decided to return the camera to the house. When he arrived, the house was shrouded in an almost supernatural darkness. Ricardo entered without hesitation and went straight to the table where the camera had been. But now, something different awaited him. Instead of the camera, there was a pile of photographs scattered across the table. He picked up the first one and almost dropped it when he saw the image. It was him again. But this time he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure, once just a vague blot, was now fully formed, with a distorted face, and its skeletal hand was resting on Ricardo's shoulder. He threw the photo back onto the table and fled the house, his heart pounding. Ricardo was never the same after that night. Since then he couldn't be near cameras. Every time he tried to take a picture or look at an old photo, he would see the shadow in the background closer than before. And the whispers never stopped. They followed him back to the city, back to his studio, and now, even in his dreams, the figure haunts him. It's said that the camera is still in the house, waiting for the next curious photographer. And those who dare to use it end up disappearing, leaving behind only their photos as proof that they once existed. And in the photos, there is always a shadow lurking, ready to claim the next soul. Story 6. The House Among the Trees. In the heart of a dense and unexplored forest, there was an isolated house that the nearby townspeople avoided at all costs. The structure was old, made of dark wood, and its windows seemed to always be covered in eternal shadow, even during the day. Few dared to approach, and those who did reported feeling a strange presence around the house, something that made them want to flee immediately. Raphael, an urban explorer and lover of supernatural stories, heard about the house while visiting a nearby town. The idea of exploring such a mysterious place intrigued him. Though the locals warned him multiple times, saying that no one ever returned the same after visiting the place, Raphael was determined. He believed the legends were just stories to scare off the curious and that at most he would find an old, abandoned house in the middle of the forest. Armed with his camera, flashlight, and a rudimentary map, Raphael set out alone for the forest. The path leading to the house was difficult to find, almost entirely swallowed by the underbrush. As he advanced, the trees seemed to close in around him, making the atmosphere grow darker and more oppressive. The sounds of birds and small animals began to fade, and the forest silence consumed the environment, creating an unsettling atmosphere. After hours of walking, Raphael finally spotted the house. It stood in the center of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees whose branches seemed to reach toward the house, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. The house's structure was deteriorated, with pieces of wood falling apart and vegetation growing in the cracks of the walls. But something about it seemed alive. Raphael felt a chill as he looked at the darkened windows, as if something inside was watching him. Determined to press on, he approached the front door and pushed it open with force. The door creaked loudly, revealing a dusty and dimly lit interior. The air inside the house was cold, much colder than outside, and there was a strong smell of dampness and rotting wood. Raphael turned on his flashlight and began to explore. The rooms were empty except for old, dust-covered furniture. There was something disturbingly unsettling about every corner his flashlight illuminated. It was as if the house was stuck in a state between abandonment and life. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the silence was so intense that it felt as if the sound of his own footsteps was being absorbed by the walls. Upstairs, Raphael found a narrow hallway with several doors. One of them was slightly ajar, and he felt a strange pull toward that room. He pushed the door open and entered. The room was small, with only an old bed and a window covered by torn curtains. However, what caught his attention the most was the large mirror on the opposite wall. It was covered by a white sheet, but Raphael could see the sheet moving slightly, as if there were a draft that he couldn't feel. Curious, he approached and with a moment of hesitation pulled the sheet off, revealing the mirror. The glass was foggy, but it still faintly reflected the room. When Raphael looked into the mirror, he saw something that made him recoil instantly. There was a figure behind him. It wasn't his reflection. It was a human silhouette, indistinct and shrouded in shadows. The eyes of the figure were two dark, empty voids, and the mouth was distorted into an expression Raphael couldn't comprehend. He quickly turned around, but there was no one in the room. He tried to convince himself he was seeing things, perhaps a smudge on the mirror, but when he looked again, the figure was closer. His heart began to race. He backed toward the door, but something stopped him from leaving. It was as if the air around him had become heavy, almost tangible, holding him in place. The mirror now reflected not just the figure, but the entire room in a distorted way, as if it was being warped by some invisible force. The figure in the mirror began to move slowly toward him, and Raphael felt a cold presence behind him. It was so close that he could hear a soft, labored breathing. Panicked, he bolted for the stairs, racing down so fast he nearly fell. The sound of heavy footsteps followed close behind, echoing through the hallway. When he finally reached the front door, he shoved it open with all his strength, feeling the cold, damp air of the forest once again. He ran without looking back, across the clearing and into the dense forest. He didn't know how long he ran, but he didn't stop until he felt he was far enough away from the house. When he returned to town, Raphael told the locals what had happened, but they only shook their heads. The house among the trees always does that, they said. It lures in the curious and never lets them leave without a mark. Raphael vowed never to return. But what haunted him, even after he had left the house, was the reflection he had seen in the mirror. Because since that day, every time he looked into any mirror, he could see a shadow in the background, waiting, growing closer. Story 7. The Forgotten Book. In the library of a small, quiet town, there was a section that few people ever visited. It was a dark corner where the oldest and most time-worn books were stored. Some of these books were so old that their covers were disintegrating, and the pages were fragile enough to fall apart if handled. However, one book in particular was different. Although it had been on the shelf for decades, its leather cover remained intact, as if time hadn't touched it at all. Eduardo, a historian passionate about rare manuscripts, had heard about this book during one of his regular visits to the library. The librarian, an old man of few words, mentioned the book with a grave voice, warning that no one should read it. There are things that shouldn't be discovered, the librarian cautioned. That book holds secrets that could change more than just your life. Intrigued and doubting the old man's words, Eduardo decided he had to see the book for himself. That evening, as the library was about to close, he made his way to the farthest section and found the book, covered by a thin layer of dust. His hands trembled with anticipation as he pulled the volume from the shelf. The black leather cover had a strangely cold texture, and the title, written in faded gold letters, was in a language he didn't recognize. Eduardo opened the book, feeling a strange resistance in the pages, as though the object didn't want to be read. The first few pages were blank, but as he flipped through, he began to find words, written in an ancient and meticulous script. The sentences were disjointed, but something in their tone made him uneasy. It was as though the book was whispering directly into his mind, not just transmitting information. At that moment, Eduardo noticed the air around him growing colder. He looked around the library, now enveloped in an oppressive silence. The lights above flickered slightly, and the distant ticking of the library's clock seemed distorted. Ignoring his growing discomfort, he kept reading. The words, though cryptic, seemed to describe ancient rituals, forgotten ceremonies, and the names of entities he had never heard of. With each page, the reading became more unsettling. Eduardo felt as if something was watching him, as if the book itself was coming to life as he delved deeper into its contents. When he reached a certain page, the words began to move. He blinked, thinking he was seeing things, but the letters wavered slightly, rearranging themselves before his eyes. The low sound of whispers began to fill the room. They were distant, indistinct voices that seemed to echo from the pages of the book, as though the words were being read by someone or something. Shaken, Eduardo abruptly closed the book. The whispers stopped instantly, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. The sensation of being watched was now palpable, almost physical. He glanced around, expecting to see someone or something in the shadows of the library, but there was nothing there, at least nothing his eyes could see. he decided it was time to leave. He left the book on a nearby table and made his way to the exit. However, as he walked away, he felt a presence following him. His reflection in the glass of the bookcases seemed off, distorted, as if a shadow was always hovering behind him, lurking. Each step echoed louder than it should have, and the library lights continued to flicker. As he stepped outside, the sense of relief was brief. Eduardo realized that the intense cold he had felt inside the library had followed him outside. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, and the whispers, now from nowhere, began to echo in his mind again. In the days that followed, Eduardo tried to ignore what had happened. He returned to his work, but something had changed. The feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. Whenever he was alone or when the lights flickered, he would hear the distant whispers in his mind, the same disjointed words he had read in the book. But what disturbed him even more were the dreams. In his dreams, Eduardo always found himself back in the library. He stood before the same book, but this time the words on the pages didn't move, they screamed. Indistinct voices surrounded him, and shadows, impossible to discern, closed in, repeating the words he had read as though they were waiting for something or someone. One night, after waking from one of these dreams, Eduardo heard the whispers clearly, this time not in his mind but in his room. He glanced toward the shelf where he kept his books and saw something that froze him with fear. The book he had left at the library was there, sitting at the top of his own books. He knew he hadn't brought it with him. The moment he reached out to touch the book, the lights in his room went out completely. And that was when Eduardo realized he was no longer alone. The shadows from his dreams were now there, in his room, lurking, moving slowly toward him, and the whispers became screams, calling his name. They say that since that night, Eduardo was never seen again. His house was found empty, and the only trace left behind was the book, open on the table with a new page written. His name. Story 8. The Window to the Abyss. In a remote village surrounded by mountains and rivers, there was an old house built high on a cliff. Of all the houses in the region, this was the only one no one dared visit. The house had one particularly terrifying feature. In one of the upstairs rooms, there was a large window facing the cliff. The villagers said that this window didn't show the real world outside, but something far more sinister. Julia, an artist fascinated by mysterious places, heard about the house while traveling through the region in search of inspiration. Always skeptical of legends and myths, she decided that the house would be the perfect setting for her next paintings. The locals tried to dissuade her, warning her about the window and what it might reveal, but Julia didn't believe any of it. To her, they were just old superstitions. Determined, Julia rented the house and set up in the room with the large window. The place, though old and dusty, had a spectacular view of the mountains and the valley below. The window was enormous, with glass fogged over from age, but none of the villagers' warnings seemed to hold any truth. Julia cleaned the window, admiring the incredible view, feeling inspired to begin working on her sketches. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the room and her works in progress. Julia was excited by the vibrant colors she used to capture the landscape. However, everything changed on the fourth night. As she prepared for bed, Julia noticed something strange about the window. There were no stars in the sky, nor the distant glow of the village lights below. Instead, the window appeared to be covered by a thick, impenetrable darkness. She tried convincing herself it was just the fog that often shrouded the mountains at night, but she went to bed, determined to ignore it. By morning, the situation had worsened. Even with the sun rising outside, the window still showed nothing but darkness. It was as if the landscape had completely disappeared, replaced by a bottomless abyss. Julia tried to open the window to see what was happening, but the latches wouldn't budge, and though the glass felt cold to the touch, the window was sealed shut as though it had never been opened. The darkness in the window wasn't natural. It seemed to pulse, alive, as if there was something within, something that wanted to be freed. The more Julia looked into the window, the more the darkness seemed to engulf her, warping her thoughts. Dark images began to flood her mind. faceless figures, shadows that seemed to watch her from the void, waiting, longing for something. In the following nights, the disturbing dreams began. Julia dreamt that she stood before the window, but instead of seeing the world outside, she saw herself standing on the other side looking back. In the dream, she would reach out to touch the glass, and the moment she did, her reflection would twist into a writhing shadow that pulled her into the abyss. She would wake up sweating, the feeling that something was about to happen gnawing at her. Determined to figure out what was going on, Julia decided to stay awake all night, watching the window. She grabbed a chair, sat down in front of it, and waited. The hours dragged on slowly, and the room seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. Around midnight, something changed. The darkness in the window began to move. Subtle ripples formed as if the darkness were liquid, and at the center, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't a reflection, nor an ordinary shadow. It was something much older. The figure, made entirely of the darkness, had a humanoid shape but no eyes, nose, or mouth. Just a dense, oppressive silhouette that seemed to feed on Julia's fear. She tried to look away, but her eyes were locked on the window. The figure moved slowly toward the glass until its formless fingers pressed against it from the inside. Julia felt a wave of panic wash over her. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. The figure kept pressing against the glass as though trying to break through. The sharp sound of something scratching the glass echoed through the room. Finally, when the terror became unbearable, Julia managed to move. She bolted toward the door, slamming it shut behind her as she fled downstairs. The scratching sound continued to echo even with the door closed. When she finally reached the outside, panting for breath, the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. She looked up toward the window of the room. And there, in the darkness of the window, the faceless figure was watching her back. Julia left the house that same night and never returned. However, the people of the village continued to speak of the house and its window. They say that if you look at the window at just the right moment, you can still see the shadow watching, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter again. And for those who dare to stay near the house at night, the sound of scratching can still be heard, coming from within the darkness. Story 9, The Forgotten Puppet. In an antique shop located in the center of an old town, there was a back room where the strangest items were stored. Among these objects was a puppet, carved from dark wood, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow the movements of anyone who got too close. The puppet, though dusty and seemingly harmless, carried a dark history that many were unaware of. Luis, a restorer of antiques, had been hired to catalog and restore the oldest items in the shop. He had always enjoyed working with objects that had a history, believing that every piece held a fragment of the past. When he found the puppet hidden in a dark corner, he was intrigued. It was larger than most puppets he had seen, and though its features were detailed, it gave an immediate sense of unease. When Luis asked the shopkeeper about the puppet's origins, the man simply shook his head and said, "That puppet should have been destroyed a long time ago. It belonged to a ventriloquist who mysteriously disappeared. Since then, no one has wanted to keep it." However, Luis paid little attention to the story. To him, the puppet was just an interesting piece that needed some repairs. He took the puppet to his small studio and began to work on it. The process was slow, as the wood was worn and the strings needed replacing. Yet, as the days went by, something began to bother Luis. Every time he entered his studio, he felt as though the puppet wasn't in the same position he had left it. At first, he thought it might just be his imagination, but the feeling of something being wrong grew stronger and stronger. One night, while sitting at his workbench, Luis heard a faint creaking behind him. He turned around quickly but saw nothing. The studio was empty except for the puppet still sitting in a chair in the corner. However, something was different about its expression. The puppet's glass eyes looked more alive, as if they were watching his every move. Trying to shake off the unease, Luis returned to his work. But the silence in the room was soon interrupted again, this time by a soft sound, barely perceptible. It was the sound of something dragging, like strings being pulled across the floor. Luis looked again at the puppet, and what he saw made his heart race. The puppet's strings, which had been loose before, were now taut, as if someone was holding them. Then, with a slow, unsettling movement, the puppet's head turned toward him, its eyes fixed on his. Louis stood up abruptly, feeling panic take hold. The puppet remained still, but the tension in the air was palpable. He decided it was too late to continue working and left the studio, locking the door behind him. However, the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Even in his own home, he felt as though the puppet was still there, observing him from a distance. In the days that followed, Luis began to have nightmares. He dreamed of being trapped in a dark room, with invisible strings binding his arms and legs. In the center of the room, the puppet watched him, its glass eyes now filled with life, and a hoarse, distorted voice echoed through the darkness, whispering his name repeatedly. He woke up every time drenched in sweat, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. He resolved to return the puppet to the shop, but when he tried, the shopkeeper refused to take it back. "It doesn't belong here anymore," the man said. "It's with you now." Confused and frightened, Luis didn't know what to do. Each night, the nightmares grew more intense, and during the day he swore the puppet moved on its own. Its wooden fingers now seemed more flexible, as though trying to grasp the air. On the last night he stayed in his studio, Luis awoke to a loud crash, as if something had fallen to the floor. He turned on the light and saw the puppet standing in the center of the room, with its arms raised as if being controlled by an invisible puppeteer. Terror consumed him. He tried to run, but the puppet strings wrapped around his legs, pulling him back into the studio. The last thing he saw before everything went dark were the puppet's cold eyes, now smiling maliciously. The next day, the antique shop was suddenly closed. Luis's studio was found empty, except for the puppet, sitting calmly in a chair as though nothing had happened. No trace of Luis was ever found, and no one knew what had really happened to him. They say that at night, if you walk near the abandoned studio, you can still hear the sound of strings dragging across the floor and sometimes the muffled laughter of a puppet, waiting for its next owner. Story 10, The Well's Call. In the center of an old farm, abandoned for many years, there was a well made of ancient stone. The well was deep, dark, and surrounded by a sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air around it. People said the well was cursed, that those who ventured too close could hear voices rising from its depths, calling out to them. The farmer who had once lived there had disappeared without a trace, and since then no one dared approach the place. Marcos, a skeptical adventurer, heard about the well during one of his trips through the region. Always curious and dismissive of superstitions, he decided that he wanted to see the well for himself. To him, it was just another exaggerated story told by locals to scare away intruders. Determined, he drove to the abandoned farm, ignoring the warnings about the place. When he arrived, Marcos found the farm in complete disrepair. The trees around were dry and twisted, and the wooden fences had collapsed. The main house was little more than a ruin, with broken windows and doors torn off their hinges. But what really caught his attention was the well. The well, made of weathered stones and covered in moss, seemed to defy time. He approached it cautiously, feeling a slight chill as he peered into the deep, dark hole. The wind blew softly, but the silence around was unnerving. Marcos leaned closer to look deeper inside, but all he saw was endless darkness. And then he heard it. A faint voice, distant, almost a whisper, seemed to rise from the bottom of the well. At first he thought it was just the wind, but the voice persisted, murmuring words he couldn't understand. The sound seemed to be getting closer, echoing off the cold stones of the well. Marco stepped back, feeling his heart race, but soon regained his composure. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses and was sure there was a logical explanation for the sound. Determined to uncover the source of the voice, Marcos picked up a rock and dropped it into the well. The sound of the rock falling took longer than expected to reach the bottom, but there was no echo, just a deep silence. The voice stopped for a moment, but soon resumed, louder and more insistent. This time he could make out words. "Come down here." The whispers were clear now, as though something at the bottom of the well was calling out to him. Marcos took a step back, cold sweat running down his face. A growing sense of unease overwhelmed him. The air around the well seemed heavier, thick, as though the very atmosphere was trying to push him inside. Suddenly, he felt a cold grip on his ankle, like something had reached out from the well to grab him. He looked down, but there was nothing there. Panic started to rise in his chest, and he decided it was time to leave. However, as he backed away, the voice grew sharper, like a desperate scream. "Don't leave me. Please don't go." Marcos began to run, crossing the field toward his car, but the voice followed him. It was as if the well were alive, calling for him, pleading for his attention. Every step he took, the sound grew louder, reverberating in his mind. When he finally reached his car, he locked the doors and started the engine, trying to escape the oppressive feeling that surrounded him. In the days that followed, Marcos couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. The voices continued to echo in his mind, even when he was far from the farm. At night, he was tormented by dreams. He saw himself standing at the edge of the well, looking into its depths, while invisible hands pulled him down. The sound of whispers was constant, promising things he didn't understand but which terrified him deeply. Determined to solve the mystery, Marcos returned to the farm, this time bringing a rope to descend into the well. He believed that if he could find the source of the whispers, he would finally put an end to it and find peace. Tied to the rope, he began to descend slowly along the damp, cold walls of the well, his lantern barely illuminating the depths. As he went deeper, the sound of the whispers grew louder, and the darkness around him seemed to close in. The voices were no longer singular but multiple, each murmuring in desperate tones, asking for help. Marcos tried to ignore them, focusing on reaching the bottom, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. When he finally reached the bottom of the well, he felt something soft beneath his feet. He shone his lantern down and saw what appeared to be human remains, tattered clothes and scattered bones. Horror washed over him, and he instinctively recoiled, but before he could start climbing back up, something moved in the darkness. A shapeless figure appeared, made of shadows and water, with hollow eyes that faintly glowed. The whispers stopped, and only the sound of water dripping echoed through the well. The figure approached Marcos slowly, its elongated hands reaching out toward him. He tried to climb the rope, but his arms trembled with fear. The figure reached him, its icy fingers gripping his ankle. And then he felt a wave of despair so intense that his body froze. The voices began to whisper again, this time in unison. "You came, you belong to us now." Marcos tried to scream, but his voice was smothered by the darkness that engulfed him. No one ever knew what happened to him. The well, however, remains there, silent in the daylight, but at night, those who approach say they can still hear distant voices, softly calling, waiting for the next curious soul to venture too close. If you've made it this far, don't forget to smash that like button to support the channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest. See you in the next story.